Dr. Smith, if you don't mind introducing item number 7.
I would just like to start by echoing the comments made by board members about both the participation of so many of our residents today, as well as the very thoughtful and respectful tone that I experience so much of the time in Montgomery County, and really appreciate that very much. The Board of Education will receive an update today on the status of the work around the district-wide policy analysis. We have our external consultants here, WXY. It's a district-wide boundary analysis is exactly that. It's an analysis. It examines the utilization of the 208 school buildings, the geographic configuration and adjacency of schools, and the racial, cultural, and socioeconomic diversity of schools. Starts with a deep data dive into the current state of our school and cluster boundaries. Redistricting and boundary work are regular parts of what school systems do to respond to changing conditions in the district. MCPS enrollment increased by high 2,600 students this year, and 23,662 students in the last 10 years. Actually, as of December, we're at 166,000 pre-K through 12th graders. New schools and new classrooms frequently require changes in where students attend school. The fact is, there have been 131 redistricting efforts in Montgomery County since the mid-'80s. As part of the Capital Improvements Program approved in November, the Board of Education authorized 4 redistricting efforts that are needed because we're going to build new schools. Those will all begin later this year and in the next 2 years. They're going to be needed because we're going to build new schools, construct additions, renovate schools, and enlarge the capacity of schools. The district-wide boundary analysis will not reassign students. The district-wide boundary analysis will not reassign students.
Say it again.
The district-wide boundary analysis will not reassign students. When I spoke of misinformation and confusion, that's what I was talking about. I was at a meeting Monday morning when a person said, well, what are you going to do about the fact that you're moving students from Churchill to Silver Spring? I've had that question hundreds of times. No one on this board, on this staff, or in this school system has said anything like that. So that obviously was created somewhere else, not here. It will not reassign students. It will serve as an important reference document, a foundational document, as we continue on the inevitable and ongoing future work of understanding how to serve all of our students. As we think about redistricting efforts that are needed in a given region, this analysis can inform which schools should be included and reviewed to most effectively maximize the facility utilization, the geographic proximity, and the student body diversity that reflects our school communities. Today's presentation will further expand on some of the key questions and aspects involved in our work on the district-wide boundary analysis and provide an update report on feedback and comments we've received through our engagement opportunities with our community. And I appreciate that Dr. Zuckerman came to the table and identified that we will answer the questions that we heard during public comment during this session. So I will turn it over now to Dr. Zuckerman, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, and good afternoon, board members and members of the community. My name is Andrew Zuckerman, Chief Operating Officer of the district, and I'll just introduce who we have here. Derek Turner, Chief Communication Officer, Essie McGuire, Executive Director for Operations, Adam Babinski, and Kushan Davi of WXY. And I'll start off the presentation. I'll turn it over to Essie, Derek, and then we'll turn it over to our architects, and we'll open it up for questions. So, as you've heard, the district-wide boundary analysis is underway, and what we're going to do today is we're going to review our project work plan. We are going to clarify some of the key misconceptions about the analysis and what we're doing, and we'll answer as many questions as we're able to today that we heard from community members, and we'll incorporate that into our presentation. We'll provide an update on our community engagement. There's been an incredible amount of engagement to date that dates all the way back to last school year. We're in the development of the RFP process. I certainly led a number of community meetings just around what we want to see in an analysis, and we'll talk about the scope and why we removed and asked our external firm to remove traffic and transportation at this stage of the process. We'll summarize the feedback and input we've received so far, and we'll review our next steps. So our project work plan, here are just the major milestones so everyone can see. Between September and October of this school year, our focus was on pre-scoping and planning. And that really was the part where we went from an approved award of contract by the board to sitting down at a staff level with our external partners and defining what that scope of work is going to look like. Part of this work between October and November is benchmarking and doing best practice analysis with other districts around the country, data analysis and baseline cluster analysis, and then we move into December and January, where there'll be the development of the interactive tool and the design that's underway there. Throughout, from October to January, we've had our phase 1 of community engagement. We're in the middle of that right now, and Derek will talk to you a little bit more about what that looks like. We intend to issue an interim report in February, later this school year, and then we'll have additional community engagement based off of that interim report, and a final report will be issued in June of 2020. So I think this is a really helpful slide, and one that we'll certainly make sure is up on our website about what the boundary analysis is and what it's not. I'll start with what it's not, just to be redundant, I suppose, at this point. This is not a redistricting process where we are intending to move student boundaries. That's not what this is. So this, and I do want to emphasize that this is a process over time that we're engaged in that will result in a series of reports that we'll provide to the board that will inform your work in the future. And so what it is a comprehensive assessment of school boundaries in light of the growth in Montgomery County. It's a deep dive, as you heard Dr. Smith say, into the data surrounding the effective use of facilities. It's a benchmarking process with other similar districts. It's an engagement effort with our community on the challenges of creating capacity and diverse schools in a rapidly growing area, and it will serve, at least our intent, is for it to be a critical data resource to inform future boundary studies. So that's what this is. And I'm going to turn it over to Essie to get into some greater detail, particularly around just a lot of questions that we've heard, and so we'll walk through those.
Thank you. So I do want to just take a few minutes to sort of talk through some of the big questions and discussion points that we hear from the community and have had with the community about the nature of the study, how it fits into some of our other work. So we're just going to walk through some of those. And one of the questions that we hear frequently is, how can MCPS continue to study specific boundary changes while this district analysis is underway? And it's an important question, but it really does relate to two very specifically distinct bodies of work. Certainly when we talk about a specific boundary change for student assignment, we have a governing policy document, and that is the board's policy, FAA, for educational facility planning. That hasn't changed. It continues to govern our work. And so specific boundary changes that are needed for that specific work that we have going on right now in specific schools and clusters related to capacity and construction. As Dr. Smith said, we're building new schools, we're adding additions onto schools, and we need to populate those because of our utilization issues. That immediate and continuous work is going forward. At the same time, what we want to accomplish here is providing that contextual backdrop that will be the foundation of all of our work going forward in these areas. It will provide that data and information that can be used in the future, and future actions will take into account the recent boundary changes that are going on right now. All of those current conditions as we move forward will be taken into consideration, as they always are, in any future actions that the board might authorize going forward. So while they're certainly related bodies of work, they are moving in tandem together, and both can continue at the same time. Another really key question is whether the district-wide boundary analysis will prioritize diversity over other factors. And again, this is a discussion of different kinds of work. The board's policy FAA does include 4 factors, and it is very clear that all 4 factors must be considered in every review of school or cluster boundaries. Those 4 factors are geography, facility utilization, student body demographics, and stability of assignment over time. Policy FAA also does specify that within the context of those 4 factors, we need to especially strive to ensure that we are creating diverse student body populations that reflect our school communities. And we've implemented that by really looking at reducing disparities, not creating disparities among schools. But again, we do that within the context of all 4 factors. The district-wide boundary analysis is going to review and analyze data through the lenses of the 4 factors across the entire system and in every possible configuration of those data points. It is to provide foundational analysis of the current state through each of those lenses. It's not to make judgments or priorities or weighting among those different lenses. It's really trying to give us more information about each of those lenses. It will not make those policy decisions. It will inform the policy decisions that the board is going to make going forward. And I think we have certainly touched on this, but I'll say it again. Will this project change school and cluster boundaries? No, it will not. Only the board can authorize a boundary study that results in redistricting and changes to school or cluster boundaries. There's nothing about this work in particular that can immediately result in that. It will inform any decisions that the board may want to undertake. And as we've alluded to and commented here, that boundary work is ongoing regardless of what we do with this analysis. We will be adding students, at least that's our projection for quite some time. We're going to be building things. We're going to be having students participate in different programs in different areas of the county. All of that will change student assignment, and all of that will be governed by the board's policy FAA. It will be informed by the work that we are doing here in the district-wide boundary analysis, again, as we move forward. I want to take just a moment, too, to talk about the final report. And I think this is one where, again, there's been both a lot of commentary and a lot of questions. And I will say, again, just in as we've really worked through this project, I think what the final report looks like is something that we are sort of learning and growing and evolving to as we go through this as well. The final report will comprehensively summarize and analyze the district-wide conditions informed through this data. It will really, we are wanting to lean into looking at the interactions and impacts of each factor on each other. These are all interrelated factors. We're an interrelated community with a variety of needs and interests that need to come together. None of them act in isolation, and I think that's really the key that we are hoping to illuminate through this report is what the nature of those interactions are and how they can be informed by each other. Throughout the entire process of the RFP, of our discussions with WXY, it's been clear that this study would not result in recommendations for specific boundary changes. Now, as we've talked about, certainly there were elements of the proposals in that back and forth stage that's been discussed around the beginning of the project, where words like recommendations were used. And certainly anytime you talk about boundaries and changes, that kind of language becomes part of the conversation. But we've been very clear that recommendations related to specific boundary changes were never part of the scope, and certainly never part of the intent of the project. However, as we've been able to refine the scope of work that we want to undertake together, and as we have brought our visions of the project together, we've been able to look at, again, what kind of findings or observations might we be able to learn from this analysis. Those kinds of recommendations will be part of the discussion, but they're really, again, recommendations about data and information, not about specific boundary changes. I also want to just take one moment, too, to talk about the issue of traffic and proximity. Certainly, it's an overstatement to say that we won't be looking at traffic at all. Traffic is an important factor of all of our lives. But it is not quantifiable data in the way that we want to be able to bring quantifiable analysis to this analysis. So we wanted to really look more at variables that can be fixed and quantified, variables like distance, variables like the walkability versus whether there's a safe walk zone or not a safe walk zone, distance to school. How many schools are in a certain distance from individual neighborhoods? How many students have schools within a half mile, a mile? What's the radius? How can we look at different configurations of proximity, adjacency, and closeness without, again, looking at the variability of traffic over time? It varies according to time of day. It also varies according to road work and other factors that just change so frequently that they wouldn't be part of this quantifiable data lens. However, we can't possibly talk about travel without talking about traffic. That's just the difference, again, between how we're analyzing data versus how we want to look at the impacts of that data. I hope that clarifies a little bit the role of traffic there.
Dr. Smith?
I was just going to say, one of the aspects of the boundary work that's resulted in specific redistricting since I've been in Montgomery County has been a very deep dive into travel time, walkability, geographic barriers, and travel time. And so when you think about this analysis, there would be no actual implementable way to talk about travel time, given that we're not going to propose to move any students from school A to school B. Until that recommendation is made or proposal is made, you can't actually look at that because it depends on the school start time, the number of buses involved, and all of those other factors. So I think that I hope helps people understand why you don't do that.
Thank you. So that really takes us through, again, a number of the key questions that I think we heard today, as well as, again, that we've heard sort of throughout this process, and that we hope we can continue to bring some clarity to in the discussion. Again, understanding that we are continuing to just work through this analysis and the project together. So with that, I think we would like to talk a little bit more specifically about our Phase 1 community engagement that we've had, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Turner to have that conversation.
Before we get started, Mrs. Modrowski had a question.
I have a question about the last part really quickly. Programs, I know that it didn't get included into the scope of the RFP and whatnot, but are they looking at all at which programs are where and where programs could potentially go or could not go at all?
So it certainly is, it's in the scope of the RFP in that it's a very important fact when we look at school utilization and where students go to school. Mm-hmm. The reason that we wanted to be sure that we were also respectful sort of the work going on with the choice study and all of that work that our curriculum colleagues are engaged in. And so what we really wanted to do was have, again, those projects be cognizant of each other and understand each other without having any kind of overlap that would cause conflict. So the short answer is, again, yes. Again, where students go to school, where those programs are, is a very important component of the analysis. But it will be fed into and sort of looked at as part of the sort of more primary approach of where students are assigned, and then that can kind of be an overlay.
So how are they factoring kids that go to different schools, whether it's based on a COSA or a program? Are they looking at areas that kids live and what is their homeschool numbers, or are they looking at where they actually go?
So both, but the primary analysis will be from school of assignment to be able to take sort of cognizance again of how those factors operate, and then we can overlay the issue of program and special assignment.
Because I didn't know that 30% of our kids went to schools other than their home schools, so it's a very interesting fact.
Yeah. And it especially comes into play when we talk about some of the big choice programs, which is really like the consortia. So that's sort of where some of those big numbers come from. And that's certainly something that we've had a lot of healthy discussion about in terms of how to be cognizant about that. And that's sort of that, again, that big overlay that's very important. I think we want to have a very primary understanding of the school of assignment, because that's really the underpinning and the foundation for these other conversations. But that overlay, we're certainly not pretending that it doesn't exist, because it's very important.
Dr. Daka?
Yeah, I don't know whether Mrs. Mondrowski was getting at what I've been concerned about, making sure the public understands that when we talk about adjacency, programs make a difference because these schools may be close together, but one school may have a much smaller population, but it's because of the kind of program that is in that school. So I just want people to really understand that that's what's happening, because they'll look at it. In fact, I think somebody sent us something about there being 7 classrooms available in some school, and, you know, why wasn't it filled? So, thank you.
All right. Mm-hmm. And when we open up for discussion, I'll start with Mr. Tinbite, and then we'll go around the table. But you go ahead. You can go ahead. Mrs. Modrowski, did you have one more thing you want to say?
Just the consortium thing. Can you just lightly touch on how they're incorporating that, because it is a big choice thing. So you're just giving each kid a home assignment, and
Yes, and so I'm sorry.
No, that was just, go ahead.
So, and again, I think probably as we start to talk more about the report and some of the data, that this might be a little clearer. But again, it's important to keep in mind too that this is an analysis of the current state and of the interplay of some of the factors of the current state. We're not trying to match students, right? So that's sort of part of that. We're having a lot of discussions, again, about how to acknowledge, because every consortia also has a base area, but then the base area is complicated by the choice aspect. And so we will be absolutely taking, again, both of those things into account, starting with the school of assignment, but not ending there. But again, what we're really looking at is the interplay of all of these factors and how they affect one another. And so it's a lot of sort of conditional moving of parts, if that makes sense. We're going to be looking at if X happens, then what's Y. But those are very fluid concepts and not so much a one-to-one correlation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so it's my turn. So communications and community engagement have been central to this process. We've heard a lot from the community saying they want to learn more, and we want to provide as much information as possible. So this slide starts with our regional meetings, but this actually began last spring when we had 4 community meetings across the county gathering information about the RFP process. So we allowed community members, thousands of community members, to provide input to this process of what was going to be in the scope. So that laid the foundation of our work. Since then, we've done a process of 6 regional community meetings. We've gone through 2 so far. We've done Gaithersburg, or 3 so far, Gaithersburg, Julius West, and White Oak. We've had to cancel and reschedule Walter Johnson, which, can I reveal the date?
Absolutely.
So January 23rd at Walter Johnson High School from 7 to 9 p.m. We're going to have the rescheduled meeting for Walter Johnson for the boundary analysis. This Saturday, we're going to Montgomery Blair, and we're going to close out with Northwest High School. And all this was built on the November 18th Board of Education public hearing, where community members were able to testify about their perspectives about this work. Additional to all the public meetings, our consultants are also doing targeted outreach to community members who are often underserved and aren't able to engage, so more direct, specific outreach. The presentation is also available online for people who can't make it out. The presentation is broken up into small chunks so community members can hop online, watch a small section, provide their feedback, come back a few days later and provide additional feedback to the next section. All the information about the process from the scope documents, I know Ms. Mondrowski, you mentioned if she could get access to the scope documents. Those are available on the web page, both the former and the updated scope. And all the information about the process from the community comments that we received from the RFP process to today is all available up on our website, and we keep updating it frequently. We are regularly sending out email reminders to both students, staff, and to family members about this process, where we are, and reminding them about upcoming dates. The good news is we're reaching a lot of folks. The Walter Johnson meeting before it got rescheduled had 600 participants, and that's when we had to cut off RSVPs because we had too many people that we could fit in the space. But we continue to see people engaged and interested in sharing their voice in this project.
Derek, can I just interject? I mean, Mr. Turner, interject just for one moment. Earlier, we heard from Mrs. O'Neill asking for us to resend out the letter from Dr. Smith and myself. We have 3 more meetings left. Can we attach the letter? That way people can also see what the boundary, what the analysis is not going to do, so people can understand that as well.
Certainly, it was included at our White Oak meeting, will be included moving forward.
Okay.
And you're correct, and another emails were sent out to explain what the process was just recently as December. So we're continuing to do outreach, and we'll continue to do more as the process goes forward and we get to the interim part of this project, and we get to the final report, and we get to the interactive tool. So the purpose of these community meetings is to actually give the community a baseline foundation of what's going on in the history and the boundaries currently in MCPS, because it's hard to provide feedback if you don't know the state of play of Montgomery County, what the boundaries currently are, what the challenges we currently face are, how many times boundaries have been changed in our community. At the first meeting, when we asked the community, how many times do you think boundaries have been changed? We polled them. Some people said 10, some people said 15, and we had an option of there 131. There was an audible gasp when people heard that we had actually changed boundaries 131 times since the 1980s. And I think that's important for people to understand that boundary changes are a part of the community's work, part of the school system's work, part of the board's work. And so we actually, in these meetings, are pairing, I actually mean the consultants who are actually doing the bulk of this work, are laying out the foundation of what the history has been, what the current system looks like, and then talking about the interplay. we have facility utilization, we have diversity, and we have geography. How do they intersect with one another so that we can really get a full sense of what our district looks like? And so at these meetings, there are facilitated discussions around tables where community members can take moments to share their thoughts, react to different pieces of information, and really be a part of the work that's going forward. And that input is taken back to WXY, and I will pass it over to them as they talk about what they're doing and what they've heard so far.
Great. Thank you, Chair, Superintendent, and members of the board for having us here today. We are pleased to be here. We have felt humbled hearing the comments from the public today. We've been eager to get feedback from the public meetings, and we've also felt humbled hearing the comments and feedback at those sessions. We want to give you simply an update on those meetings that we've had so far, and of course take any questions that you have. So, as Mr. Turner has mentioned, we are in the midst of our major public meetings. We've had 3 public meetings so far. We have 3 more to go, and we will also be starting to do a lot of our targeted outreach going forward. And that work really takes us through February going forward. So we'd like to describe to you a bit about what we've heard, but we want to begin with a brief description of how we've set out these meetings. We've been working very closely with a group called Public Engagement Associates. They've been critical to our work. They're a sub-consultant on our team, and together we've worked to set up a format. First, that starts with focus presentations, and that is an introduction to some of the data that will be in our interim report, but it's not inclusive of all the data that will be going into our interim report. We really tried to keep things concise in order to draw people into the work, but not to overwhelm people with a lot of information. We really emphasize the idea of having small group discussions so that people can enter into a dialogue and really look and consider the data in front of them. And that's something that WXY believes in. That's something that Public Engagement Associates believes in. Public Engagement Associates in particular, they've grown out of a movement called America Speaks, which focuses on deliberative democracy and the idea of working at small group tables so that people can have this kind of dialogue. As people sat at the meetings, there were facilitators at these tables capturing comments. We have spreadsheets that when we're through all 6 of our meetings that we'll be able to publish the comments, the themes that came up at these meetings. And we got an enormous amount of feedback. And there were maps at those meetings. As has been discussed, those maps really meant to focus on the kinds of adjacencies in terms of the 3 critical factors of utilization, diversity, and proximity. We also took polling data, and we'll go through that in this presentation, really just getting automatic quick feedback from people. And then as we went, and as there were concerns about transparency, we added a section at the beginning of our meetings that really sought to clarify the frequently asked questions that we've been receiving. So as Mr. Turner mentioned, we've had 3 meetings so far. We've had almost 1,000 participants and well over 50 trained facilitators at those meetings. The first meeting was in Gaithersburg, December 4th. The second meeting was Julius West on December 11th. And the third meeting was White Oak Middle School. Fourth meeting, weather kept us from doing that. So at that first meeting at Gaithersburg, we had 325 participants. And what I do is just provide a brief overview of some of the comments that we received back. I think straight off, there were a number of questions about the scope and about transparency. There was some confusion about the relationship of this work to the Clarksburg, Seneca Valley work. And so we have recorded all of those comments as we've gone. There were concerns about movement across the county, and I think a lot of the comments today hopefully have addressed some of those questions. There was a real emphasis in terms of people's interests on proximity. There were also questions and interests on the role of educational quality in this study. And there were concerns about the impacts of potential boundary changes on students and families.
Ms. Silvestri?
Are you just taking those concerns? Is anyone responding to some? You do that in the frequently asked questions, but do people have to wait to the next meeting to have some of the things that come up that could be answered there?
So the facilitators at the table are able to answer some of those questions, and at, for instance, the Julius West meeting, we essentially stopped the presentation that we were doing in order to answer some of those questions. And in the case of the White Oak Middle School presentation, which has been the most recent one, we began with probably 15 minutes of frequently asked questions that we reviewed and provided people with answers to those frequently asked questions. We then took more questions at that time on the questions we were receiving, and then we also spent an extra hour at the end of that meeting answering questions that we hadn't received yet, that we simply went around the auditorium and got further feedback. So at Julius West, there were 400 people there. In that meeting, we really did have to change the meeting format because there were concerns about transparency and there were a number of interruptions. So we didn't get to some of the polling and table conversations that we certainly want to have. And so we stepped back and answered a number of those questions. Some of the concerns that we did hear about related to proximity, distance, travel. We understood from comments that diversity is valued by many, and others felt like it should not be a factor in the analysis. White Oak Middle School, again, the most recent, we had 250 participants there. There was also questions about educational quality and school programs and resources and the role that played. There was particular interest in the impact on consortia and school choice in the analysis. Obviously, some back and forth there. We also started to hear from people who wanted to see a more comprehensive analysis of boundaries, including recommendations on boundaries. So clearly some people pushing back on that change in the scope. And then there were concerns about how diversity has been defined and will be defined. In the context of these presentations, we start by looking at EverFarms. We have made clear to people that we will use many different lenses to look at diversity in the interim report.
Okay, can we just give Mr. Tinbite to get his question?
Yeah, I have a quick question. So what's been our plan on student outreach? Are there any discussions on either a large town hall style meeting or direct outreach to student groups?
Yeah, so I think our approach so far has been that we through the course of these 3 meetings, we are learning who are turning out, and then we are learning what are some of the people's perspectives and also sort of where that's coming from. And I think what is that informing us to do on our end is to come up with a strategy on who we want to engage with as we sort of get into the next round of meetings. And student outreach is certainly one of our key focus groups. We want to understand, we do, before we sort of dive into the specifics of that, we do want to understand how do you want to conduct that meeting, whether that is sort of a large meeting setting or whether sort of there are separate focus groups that we want to conduct through phase 2. So, yeah.
And let me just add in 2 pieces. We actually sent out a direct email to all students in the secondary level, inviting them to these meetings. And PEA has been working with schools to make sure that principals know that students are encouraged to participate in these meetings.
I also suggest student outreach to district-wide student groups, also maybe coordinating with Shella Cherry, who's in the student leadership unit, so that way she'd be able to connect you all with other student groups to get student feedback.
Dr. Smith?
I've actually spoken to Ms. Cherry about that, and she is going to work with the team to make sure that happens across a whole variety of different county-wide student groups.
Okay, sounds good. Appreciate it.
Okay. You can continue.
So I want to take a few minutes to summarize the feedback that we got around the three lenses that we've been looking at. So in terms of themes around utilization, first we heard concerns about overcrowding and the use of portables, and people wanting to know how portables will fit into our utilization data study. Second, there were concerns about historic accuracy of enrollment projections. Enrollment projections is not something that we're looking at. There was an interest in school programs such as magnet programs and language programs as a driver of enrollment. Fourth, there was a real acknowledgement that school growth and utilization happens relative to housing and development and transportation policy, so people wanted to see how that could be recognized. Fifth, they wanted to understand disparities based on geography, and some of that relates to population density as well. Sixth, utilization as tied to development and planning, so that's similar to understanding it in the wider context. Seventh, understanding the construction of new schools and how that's occurring and whether that is in fact keeping pace with the rate of growth. There was a lot of interest that elementary schools have the most overcrowding as opposed to high schools and middle schools, and I've mentioned enrollment projections. In terms of diversity, there was an interest in clarifying the weighting of diversity in relation to other factors. I think we've heard today that is really being seen as part of an equal weighting in terms of with utilization and proximity. There was a desire to broaden the definition of diversity, and again, in the context of this session, we were using EverFarms, but the idea that we will look at racial dissimilarity, ESOL, look at farms, those will all be part of our interim report. There was an interest in better support for ESOL students. There was an emphasis on interest in looking at school resources, staffing and support systems, as well as boundary changes. And there was an interest in relating diversity to student performance. There was interest in understanding diversity as it varies across the county, and I think, our work has been focused on adjacencies rather than looking from one end of the county to another. And then there's, again, more comments about resources and looking at farms relative to performance.
Dr. Smith.
Can you speak a little bit about how you are using EverFarms and defining that term and how you think about that as part of this conversation?
Sure, and thank you for that question. We do realize that has been sort of one of the hot button topics. So the way that we look at EverFarms is that farms, we all know what free and reduced meals are. So students who have ever been through the course of their journey, who have ever been on farms, are sort of marked as EverFarm students. Now, the way that we like to think about it is that if you look at, for example, a family of four, and if you look at what their sort of median income is, which is about $47,000, if you sort of cross that mark, whatever that mark is, if you cross that mark, your kid in the school system will not be part of farms anymore. But that just by the virtue of going over by $1,000, for example, you're still not better off at the end of the day. So EverFarms in that case does provide us with a better sort of comprehensive look at socioeconomic issues when compared to farms. So that does not mean that we'll not be looking at farms, but we'll be looking at both of them.
Okay. Ms. Silvestre.
I also understand that we use EverFarms because oftentimes older students,
Right.
because they don't want to be embarrassed by participating in free and reduced lunch, do not take advantage of it, but they truly are eligible, and therefore there is an undercount that exists, is a reality in our schools.
That's absolutely right.
So we also took a number of comments on proximity, a number of themes that were emerging. Comments that bus travel times were more important or as important as walk zones. There was a real focus on people talking about community schools and their importance. There were concerns about the increases to travel time. There was an emphasis on student safety and how that relates to distance and travel times. There was an interest in the impact of choice programs, magnet schools, and the consortium on the proximity analysis and how that was done. And in our initial analysis that was presented, we were looking at the basis of the home assignment process. There was a desire to factor in traffic patterns, and again, there was an emphasis on new development and growth. So now, and I understand some of these slides may be a little harder to read, but we simply wanted to present some of the polling data from these meetings. And again, this is not reflective of the county. This is just when people were clicking on keypads at the meeting, how they were responding. So in terms of where people were coming from, the December 14th meeting in orange, that's the White Oak meeting, and the blue lines on the graph, that is from the Gaithersburg meeting. And so you see that the White Oak Middle School meeting, that was predominantly, almost half of the attendees were from the South or the Southwest, and the Gaithersburg meeting was predominantly people from the Southwest or the North Central area. But there was essentially fairly geographically clustered response from people attending those meetings. In terms of who attended those meetings, and not geographically, but how they related to the school system, at the White Oak meeting, about half of the attendees were parents. At the Gaithersburg meeting, about 2/3 of the attendees were parents, and the rest of the people either used to have children in the school system, or they have kids but aren't yet in the school system. So we wanted to get feedback on how people were viewing the work underway. And again, these are the first meetings that we've been having, so hopefully this will improve as we go forward. And you can see the 14th meeting, which was the more recent meeting, about 23% of the people felt a degree of skepticism of the process. But there were also about 23% of the people who said that the analysis has some pros and cons. We need to be careful about how it's done, but saw the value. And then finally, at that meeting, just over half the number of people attending felt that it was important to continue with this effort. The first meeting that we did, which was in Gaithersburg, had a high degree of skepticism of the work, and that was back on December 4th. About 65% of the people felt skeptical of the process. About 25% of the people felt like there were pros and cons of doing the work. And in terms of how people experienced the meeting, and of course, this polling data continued throughout the meeting, and so this was, I think, probably the last poll that was taken. So at the Gaithersburg meeting, question as to whether people felt uncertain about the project, about 17% still felt uncertain about this project. About 20% said that they were pretty familiar and didn't learn too much. About 30% said they learned a little bit that they didn't know about MCPS and the issues that were discussed. And then about 24% said they learned a great deal that they did not know. So fairly evenly divided across that meeting. And then at the Gaithersburg meeting, predominant responses, about 24% said they learned a little that they didn't know about MCPS, and then about 48%, testing my eyesight, learned a great deal that they didn't know before the meeting. So just to conclude here, we have a couple more slides, but the recurring questions that we've received across the 3 meetings: what is the purpose of the study and why now? How is this related to ongoing work? And of course, for us coming into Montgomery County, it's clear that this is a complex set of issues, even more complex because you continue to grow, you continue to figure other things out, and these things are often, confused in people's minds. We were asked a considerable number of times, will this analysis make boundary recommendations or changes? We, I think, have affirmatively answered that it will not be making recommendations. People wanted to know about the weighting of the work, And of course, those three lenses really looked at, considered equally in this work. People asking about what the final report will address and how that information in the interim report, will they be made public, which they will be. As I mentioned, how will this study be analyzing diversity? How does school diversity impact student performance? Came up on a number of occasions. Will the data and models that the consultants use be made public? What is our experience doing this work? All of these things we have tried to answer through frequently asked questions, a review of them at the beginning of meetings. That's something we'll continue to do, and I think will be published on the MCPS website. Why is this scope different from the original proposal, and how will this feedback be integrated into the reports? So we also have additional work to do as part of this phase, which is really continuing to dive into stakeholder interviews, focus groups with hard-to-reach communities. We have actually 3 remaining meetings. This was done and submitted before Walter Johnson was canceled, and then there's online feedback that is being collected. And then as we move through the winter, we'll move into to phase 2, and there will be continued outreach, continued analysis. There'll be an interim report delivered at the end of February, and there'll be a development of an interactive tool. And that tool, which we're working on now, is really meant to allow people to explore the data and understand the interconnectedness and the way of layering utilization, diversity, and proximity, and understanding how those work together. And we want to capture a lot of feedback as people engage with that interactive tool. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, I will open it up to board members. I'm going to start with Mr. Tinbite. Go around the table.
Sure. So one question that I have is, do we have any data on the average length of bus times in MCPS?
We do. We have sort of a variety of ways of looking at that, and I think one thing that's interesting in looking at the average bus time is that again, it's just so different in different areas of the county, and so an average taken in everywhere from Damascus and Clarksburg to Silver Spring, that average is not going to be particularly relevant. And what's interesting in the conversations that we have with our community around travel bus times is that what one community might consider a long bus time, another community would be happy to have as a short bus time. Because again, it really is so much about that personal experience and what your neighborhood and your area looks like. So we really try to look at it more in the context, again, of a specific school experience or community experience and sort of what that's grounded in. We do have charts and tables that we've shared, and we can share again in terms of what our ranges are. Again, that also varies according to sort of regular homeschool transportation. Of course, the times can get much longer with some of our choice transportation, but again, those are clearly, in a different configuration that families are choosing. So there are sort of a lot of different ways that we look at it.
So can the data that you all have so far be forwarded to the board again?
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Ms. Dixon.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to just mention and thank Dr. Smith for saying, I think 3 times, that we have not made any decisions about any boundary changes or anything related to this study. So this may take some time, and tell me if you feel uncomfortable or put on the spot. But the recurring questions that are listed here, you stated what those questions are. But what I'd like to do is just go through each one, and I'd really like to hear what you said to the public in response to each one. So could we do that? They don't have to be lengthy. Some of them are, could be a one-word answer, I think. But I do think it would be useful, and especially those who are watching us right now. Okay, so the first question
Dr.
is.
Smith. I was just going to say, Ms. Dixon, I just wrote down that we're going to take those reoccurring questions from the PowerPoint and send answers to the BOE. So I think this, you're right, we should do what you just asked to the greatest
Okay.
degree possible. Then we're going to send those answers to you, and then we're going to post them on our website. So
Okay.
I think this is such a good idea.
Right.
Thank you.
So, do we want to have them
Well,
do
that can
that
go-
now?
that can go
Yes.
places with all of our
Possible,
questions.
yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So, and I will just say that we do, so we have the text for these that we have worked into the presentations. I will be honest, I don't have it all with me right now. So we're going to have to do this a little free form, and I think that the more formal, structured answers that we will be posting on the website, are just, they're a little bit in progress, and they are pretty lengthy. So I think we'd be happy to sort of run through some of maybe the Cliff Notes version, if I could put it that way.
Right.
And then the more formal document absolutely will be available. But again, I didn't bring it to read, but I'm very happy to do sort of, again, a less formal version of that.
Right. Okay, so I'll read the question.
Sure.
And then, you can give us a response. If you don't feel comfortable doing that right now, I think, it's okay to say, we'd like to develop that and flesh that out more, okay? But I think it's really important that we be transparent with all of this, because, the board's been accused of not being transparent and, lacking integrity and in that. And I do have a problem with that, because acting with integrity is very, very important, and being transparent about everything that we do, I think, is very important as well. So what is the purpose of this study, and why now?
And so I think that the purpose is really to have that deep dive into understanding the current state of our school and cluster boundaries, understanding how those conditions in our schools and clusters related to facility utilization, related to student body demographics, related to proximity to schools, how those factors are interrelated with each other now, and whether there are opportunities to have those factors align in a way that better aligns to board policy and to make effective use of our schools in our school communities. Why now is sort of because why not now, right? There's been so much change and growth in our county. We know that these issues are pressing in so many areas of our county, and it's something that people have been asking for and talking about for a while, including board members, staff members, and community members, and so now seems like the moment.
Dr. Smith?
May I add to that?
Yes.
I'll give you two examples that I think are, in my early tenure here, we did the Silver Creek. We didn't have this information. Had we had this information, we might have gone more broadly. Bayard Reston, we didn't have this information. We had a small number of schools in the cluster. Had we had the change for adjacent schools in the policy, and had we had this information, we might have gone more broadly. Because we didn't have the information this year, but because the board was moving in this, trying to be a lot broader in its thinking and look at all the factors more comprehensively, we cast a very wide net in the Seneca Valley, Northwest, Clarksburg. I believe this will put us somewhere in a much better middle space that we can use the information to really look and say, what's a logical, reasonable resolution that the board would put forth to identify the scope of an actual redistricting effort. That's why I think it needs to be done now, and we're over capacity so many places in the county.
Right. We've been adding the equivalent of a high school in terms of numbers of students for the last 10 years.
That's right.
Which is, okay. Is this process related to the recent Clarksburg-Seneca Valley boundary change?
So the short answer is no. The longer answer is that again, the Clarksburg-Seneca Valley boundary change is a specific boundary study to change student assignment that the board authorized specifically because we're making Seneca Valley significantly larger as a way to help relieve overcrowding at Clarksburg and Northwest High School specifically. So that study was conducted in accordance with policy FAA and with our regulation, and that took place under those guidelines. Again, this analysis will be that backdrop that can inform similar efforts in the future.
And that Seneca
Yes.
Valley process was years in the making
Yes, it
before
was.
this district-wide boundary analysis was.
So, and I think it's important to answer that question, to say, no, it wasn't. Okay. Will this analysis make boundary recommendations or changes?
Oh, no. That one I think we said.
How will the weighting of the three lenses, utilization, diversity, proximity, factor into this analysis?
Well,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and what is MCPS's approach to weighting these lenses?
And so again, I think what's interesting is that we really do have a difference between the board's policy and how we apply policy to the decisions around boundary studies, and how the analysis is going to look at all of the factors, because the analysis is intended to provide that data foundation for all of the factors equally. We'll analyze them, and we'll look at their interrelatedness equally with each other. Again, decisions that the board make are informed by that analysis and informed by policy.
Right. And I think the key word there is equally, which is, I think, something that, folks need to understand as well. Okay. What will the final report address? Will the interim final reports be made public?
So I'll take the easy one first. Yes, the interim and final reports definitely will be made public, and we are posting and wanting to make available all the documentation related to the project. So those will be public as well. I think the final report, again, is really wanting to look at those interrelatedness of data, look at the implications of each factor on each other, the interaction of each factor with each other. What are areas in the county and in the school district where those factors are in alignment? Where are areas where they are out of alignment? Are there possibilities or opportunities in different areas of the county to better maximize our facilities and align with board policy? We'll be looking for those kinds of opportunities, but really, again, just looking for that backdrop of information that can be brought forward in the future.
Okay. How will this study be analyzing diversity?
So I spoke to this earlier, but at the public meetings, we've been looking at EverFarms, but we will also be looking at farms. We will also be looking at race in terms of racial dissimilarity. We'll also be looking at ESOL. We're also interested in hearing back from people in terms of the meetings that we're having, if there are other ways that people think we should be analyzing diversity.
Okay. How does school diversity impact student performance?
So in a way, this isn't really part of our scope of work. We're looking at utilization, diversity, and proximity.
Okay. Will the data and models that the consultants used be made available to the public?
I think this one's a little tricky because with our data, of course, we do have privacy regulations that we have to follow very closely. And so I think it sort of depends what people mean by that question. Again, all of the documentation related to the project in terms of the outputs, in terms of the maps, the analyses, what we can of the tool, again, all of those things respecting the privacy rights that go along with our data, which is very sensitive and very important, that can be made public. But again, there are going to be, just by nature, some elements of data that are restricted.
Okay. Right. What is the WXY team's experience with school capacity and boundary analyses?
So we're currently finishing work in Lancaster, Pennsylvania on looking at school capacity and looking at their school boundaries with recommendations on school boundaries. We've worked with the city of New Rochelle. We conducted enrollment projections for them, looked at the impact of those enrollment projections and new development and new rezoning, not school rezoning, but building rezoning of their downtown and the impact on those school capacities and school boundaries. We did that as part of an environmental impact study. We've worked with Boston Public Schools. They redid their assignment policy about 5 years ago, and we conducted analysis of those options. We've been working in New York City in several districts. We did a study for District 15 that looked at the middle school assignment policy. We're working in 4 districts now, looking at essentially assignment policy, school zones, a number of issues that involve us looking at school utilization, looking at diversity, also looking at proximity as part of those work tasks.
Great, thank you. Why is the current scope different from the original proposal?
And so again, this really is just that evolution of project planning and project development. As I think Dr. Smith well outlined earlier, when we do put out a request for proposals, we get back people's proposals and ideas, and we learn a lot from those. Sometimes there are pieces we want to add, sometimes we know there are pieces that don't work, but again, it is that process of identifying a group that we really feel confident about working with, which we absolutely have here, and then working with those experts to develop a scope of work that is useful and interesting, as well as in alignment with the board and the system's interests. And that's the process that we followed here.
Thank you. And the last question, how will the feedback from community meetings be incorporated into your analyses?
So both the interim report and the final report will really emphasize and have a section on the community engagement and essentially capturing what people said, how they responded to data, what kind of ideas they had. Certainly now, if we're hearing about desires for certain kinds of analyses, we can also help perform those analyses in our work. So it's really central and critical to our work to capture comments from the community, and we're eager to have sessions that allow us to capture that feedback.
Great. So I just want to thank you for your work, and and thank you also for continuing to do the work as well. Thank you.
Related to Ms. Dixon's request, I think that the question on how does school diversity impact student performance is an important one. And I know it's not part of your work, but I think us as a school system should include that in the written response to these.
Correct, and that was in Ms. Evans and Dr. Smith's letter to the community outlining
Yes.
the importance of diversity.
Well, Ms. Dixon, you may have single-handedly answered every question that board members would have. So that's perfect. That's perfect, right? That we went through the recurring questions. I don't see any lights. If you have a question.
You were going around the room.
I was, but I didn't know if we covered it all.
When no one
Mrs.
puts their
Mondrowski.
lights on because. Yes, thank you very much for doing this presentation. I think it's really important that we get as much information as often as possible and put it out there as broadly and strongly and repeatedly as absolutely possible. I've already heard from people who are like, I hope this is going to be, on the website. I hope you're going to send this out to schools. I hope this presentation is going to go directly to parents with a link to watch the video. I too hope that we're going to do all of those things because I think it's really important. A couple of thoughts, questions. The community feedback. I know you touched on a lot of it. I had heard from quite a few people that they felt that the community meetings were more about the consultants explaining to the group what they were doing as opposed to collecting actual feedback and stuff. Now, I can see from your presentation that there were questions, but I think in thinking about it a little bit, I think part of the thing might have been that not everybody who was there got a tool and got to participate, especially when it was standing room only. So people who might have been there, even at the tables, like back tables, that didn't have any of the clickers and weren't able to participate, didn't think that you were actually necessarily collecting the information. So if there was a way that we could better communicate to people when this tool becomes available, that they can go back and still give feedback and input, and it would be collected and added to. I think that would be very important for people.
So absolutely, and I do want to emphasize too that this is not a point-in-time feedback process. So that's not the only opportunity. So certainly at the community meetings, we collected notes and feedback. We will be, in addition to the clicking that we showed here. Again, we also just took open comments from people that wrote them down. We had mechanisms to collect those. We're going to be compiling and posting all of that. Also, we do have online. When folks go to watch the presentation, they can comment right there, and those are submitted and received to us. And we will absolutely be continuing to engage and collect feedback as we go forward. I think, and as we sort of continue to take deeper and deeper dives into the material, we'll be able to collect that feedback from folks in a variety of ways, and it will all be added together. That was not like the only time to talk, and then we're not going to consider anything else. It's really a long and continuous process through the project.
Yep. Nope. I appreciate that, and staying in that space. we heard even in public comments this morning, concerns about us making sure that we're meeting people where they are. I brought this up at the work session when you all presented the first time, door knocking and things like that. Even with the student groups, it's important that we're not just hearing from the same people. Like with the students, we heard from a lot of kids from Richard Montgomery and stuff. When we were doing the holding facility discussion for Northwood, we heard a lot of different types of concerns in terms of travel times and things like that. So I just want to make sure that we're really making sure that we're not hearing from just the PTA people or just the student government people or just the parents who can afford or whatever are capable of being here in the middle of an afternoon. And so a lot of times that's going to really involve very specific and pointed, targeted, I guess is the word I'm looking for, outreach.
And I'm great that you brought that up, because I think targeted and focus groups are such an important part of our process. Again, we do realize that not everybody can attend these meetings, and so we want to make sure that we maximize these target groups, we reach out to them where they are, and be part of their agenda items. So one of our sort of efforts that we are undergoing right now is to sort of reach out to a wide variety of groups. We are casting a wide net. We are trying to sort of figure out if we can be part of their weekly meeting agenda items, right? So trying to sort of make sure that we have the same discussion that we are having with a broader audience, but with a more specific focus group. And so that's a work in progress, but that is definitely one of the things we want to focus on as we even move into phase 2.
I was going to add, one thing that we can't control is people who decide that they're going to come to every single meeting. Like, we can't dictate who comes to the meetings.
And I'm not suggesting that we should. I'm just saying
So
there are a lot of people who won't come to any of the meetings. But if we held a meeting at their leasing office of the apartment complex or the development that they live in, that might be a game changer for some people in terms of them being able to just walk to where the meeting is and it being there if there's childcare and stuff like that as well. I'm going to keep going, but if you want to, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, it was tied to this. So when doing targeted community outreach and reaching out to disadvantaged folks, what community organizations are you all reaching out to, if you have any at the top of your head?
Right.
So I know we've been working with Impact Silver Spring on outreach, and they actually held their own session early, maybe spring or summer of last year. We've also had our consultants and the community engagement folks reach out to them as well to figure out what are the groups that are hard to reach and how do we reach those? Because as a system, we often have a hard time reaching communities, one, who have language barriers, but also who are not yet in the system. We are really good at getting hold of our pre-K through 12 folks, but if you are a parent who's out of the system or if you don't have kids in the system yet, it's really difficult for us to reach those families. So it's been essential that they've been a voice in this conversation with us.
And if anyone wants to recommend organizations or committees, who's the pinpoint person that they should reach out to?
They can reach out to me and I'll work with our consultants.
Okay.
That's great. Yeah, I was gonna say, because I know like Montgomery County even has like housing project agencies and things like that that might be good to work with in terms of getting broader feedback. And then the last thing that I just want to add is in listening to, by the way, I appreciate you asking to have these questions read because I do think it's important that people have the opportunity to hear the answers. One thing that I had heard from people after some of the meetings, and in listening to your answers, I kind of processed it in my mind the way I suspect maybe some people did. And I think that a lot of the concerns were more about the policy aspect of it. And when you mentioned that you are looking at these boundaries and potentially not making recommendations, of course, but looking at ways that it could be aligned better with our policies, I think that's where some people's concerns come in terms of A, thinking what happened in Clarksburg, and B, the way that the policy was changed and all that kind of stuff. I think that when they hear we're trying to align this with the policy, if they don't agree with the policy necessarily, then that's going to come across as a potential concern for them. I'm very supportive of the idea that we look at adjacent boundaries, but I'm a very strong advocate of neighborhood schools and proximity, And I think that one of the reasons that real-time transportation times are so important to people is because while adjacent sounds right next to it, it could potentially be a significant distance away. And in the way this county runs and works and the way traffic patterns go, I mean, if you're trying to go up county at anytime after 3 o'clock, you've got a bit of a problem time-wise, and if you're trying to go down county in the mornings. So it's just, I think that that's why people are really pushing to make sure that we are incorporating real-time transportations, even though I get that it's not, Dr. Zuckerman and I totally understand and respect that it is not a set variable, it's fluctuating. But I think that, I think it would have I think it would carry a lot of weight in terms of getting people's comfort levels better, because, like I said, what we might think of as close, because it's only a 1.5 mile difference, could be a significant time-wise.
And we just make the distinction that the boundary analysis doesn't have the traffic information the way that you're describing, but our boundary studies do. And I think that's the important thing, that when we do have these specific boundary studies, there is travel time incorporated in there. So that's part
So I appreciate that, but when you do those analyses, though, like, we don't ever see that when we talk about when boundary suggestions. I'm sorry, I'm a little cloudy. I have a very bad cold, but I wanted to be here for this conversation, so I feel like I'm stammering a little bit. But when you get boundary suggestions to us or whatever, I've never seen that aspect of it. So I can't really even.
You mean the distance?
No, we see the distance, but I'm talking about what the work was done, right, with the time. Well, you put the time in, but it doesn't show where, like, what time of the day, or how it was analyzed and stuff like that. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to sound like you don't do it, I'm just saying maybe people don't understand, including myself.
Well,
Dr. Smith.
we actually do. If you remember the move from part of Gaithersburg, the small housing development happened right after I came here. Unity, that was almost the entire conversation.
Right.
That was the example of that. We also most recently, at the redistricting that occurred this fall, was a big part of the conversation. But that's always, I would just say to the board, that's always available to you. We'll spend as many hours with you as you want to spend looking at it. It's not possible in a boundary analysis because you're not recommending to change any students from school A to school B. Therefore, you have nothing specific to measure. In a redistricting effort that is a boundary study, then you absolutely have to do that, and you have to do it at the time the students go to school. And some of our students get on a bus earlier in the morning, some don't get on a bus until 9 o'clock in the morning. And so all those things, and I'd also point out, I was very much in support when the board changed the policy FAA about adjacency, because if you've been around this county now as much as I have, you know that you can be in the same cluster and be a long way from a school, and you can be down the street from a different cluster and be absolutely in proximity to that school.
Right.
And so none of it is simple. It all requires that you look at it very specifically and use almost a Rubik's Cube kind of strategy to look at how all the different factors fit together. And by the way, when we talk about how we analyze diversity, since I arrived here, the diversity is included in every single redistricting proposal.
Right.
So this is not a new thought. It's there for our students who receive free and reduced meals. It's there for our students who are English learners. It's there for our students who experience economic disparities. And it's there for our students based on race and culture and by percentages. So doing this work, in the state of Montgomery County Public Schools right now will help us, as one of our public comments said today, when my children were moved from this school to that school for a program, I think if we had had this information, it would have been useful. And I know it would have been useful to the curriculum instruction folks as they worked with the facility folks at that time to be able to look at the lay of the land in that area.
Right.
They weren't going to look at the lay of the land 30 miles away. They're going to look at right there within these schools. So I think all of those pieces are incredibly complicated.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments, because it is really complicated, and I just think people need to hear. So the only other thing I'm just going to say is, again, about how we're going to, I would love to get a little idea of how we're going to communicate to people that this is online, and that there's the tool and they can still participate. And that's it.
Ms. Wolf?
I wanted to thank you for your presentation, particularly being able to answer those questions that quickly off the top of your head. You did an excellent job. I just have one suggestion, and I know you covered this at the beginning, that the policy has 4 factors, but in the recurring question, it's how are you going to weight the 3 factors. I think it's very important to talk about all 4 when you provide that answer online, because I'm sure that, and I know that I've heard also from the people who have recently undergone boundary changes, what is this going to mean to us?
No, absolutely, and I think you're right. I think we do need to be a little bit more explicit about including that in the presentations. We were focusing more on the ones where we could show maps more easily than the stability, but we have actually been having a lot of conversation about how to represent that data of stability in the interim report, and so I think people will see that coming forward more, but I appreciate that suggestion.
Thank you.
Mrs. O'Neill?
Yes, just an observation about communication and people getting their information. In a county of over 1 million people, and we were talking about the Walter Johnson meeting that was canceled or postponed, there would have been 600 people. We had 200 plus at White Oak, 400 at Gaithersburg, but that's a drop in the bucket in comparison with the greater Montgomery County. And many people are just getting their information from Facebook groups, such as the folks sitting over here, the neighbors, people for neighborhood schools, or the One Montgomery people. And, 6,000, 2,000, that's where their information's coming. Or I may be at my neighborhood coffee shop, and somebody says to me, aren't you concerned about your school, your neighborhood school? So putting out information, but also those who are moderating those groups have an obligation to put out accurate information. Dr. Smith restated, there's no imminent boundary change as a result of the boundary analysis. There's no immediate or, imminent. And we have talked about geographic proximity. And that is, whether it's maximizing walkers or riding the bus to your neighborhood school. And when we talk about transportation, while the transportation times are difficult to analyze, and we do it when we do specific boundary studies, I think we can put out the information about who are our 105,000 kids who are riding buses. X number are going to special education programs outside of their neighborhood. X number of kids are going to immersion programs or magnet programs, because all of that factors into it. And X number of kids ride a bus to their neighborhood school. I had someone email me right after the tragic situation of the little girl from Bradley Hills. This person emailed me and said, if we didn't have FAA and we weren't busing kids all over the county, this tragedy wouldn't have happened. This little girl rode the bus home from her neighborhood school. That neighborhood is like directly across Whittier Boulevard from me. It is a neighborhood just like mine without sidewalks. And my elementary kids rode the bus to their neighborhood school because there are no sidewalks and it was an unsafe walking distance. I think we need to define who the 105,000 children are. I know 30% are choice students in the consortiums, but the special education students, which we provide daily pickup from their homes, immersion, etc., all, that should be broken out so people can see that children do move about this county, as part of our choice and special programs. But I ask those who are posting on listservs or Facebook groups to put out information. Take the information from our website, and take the board president and superintendent's letter, walkability, maximizing walkability, and proximity as defined by adjacency. That is spelled out in policy FAA.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Neill. Dr. Daka.
I just really want to thank you for all the work that you've put in the study itself. And to me, the numbers that have come out are enormous. We have lots of programs here, and we never get that amount of people to come out and to ask questions, so we appreciate that. And we want to thank staff for the work that they did to help provide materials to you. And thank you for the presentation today.
Ms. Silvestre.
Ms. McGuire, I wanted to ask you about the policy, and we talk about the 4 factors being weighed equally, but the policy language does say especially strive for a diverse student body. Could you explain for us how the regulation lays that out so that it can be implemented in this and other analysis?
Absolutely. And so the policy does emphasize that all the 4 factors matter, that the 4 factors all must be considered, and that every option must consider all 4 factors. There is, as we've noted, the language about especially striving to create diverse student bodies and diverse student body population, thank you, that's what I meant to say, in our schools, and again, to be reflective of our communities. The way that we really work that through in the regulation in terms of implementing that is to look at, within the context of all of the factors, working not to create or increase disparities among schools, to have schools be able to, again, reflect their community in each context as closely as possible without causing other disparities in other factors. And also, again, that those other factors and any requirements that they might present in terms of physical barriers. I think 495 is a good example, 270. There are certain realities in our physical world that we're always going to be cognizant of, as well as with our schools and our utilization. And so those factors have to always be the context in which all of the factors operate, and that's really how we operationalize that, is within a range of choices that work within all the factors. We want to be sure we're not making disparities worse or creating new ones in the student bodies and among schools.
So does diversity have more weight than the other factors?
Dr. Smith.
I'll respond. I'm the one who makes the final recommendation to you. Does diversity have more weight? In order for it to have more weight, it would actually have to have a value. And some of the folks today said that I said that this, in April when it was proposed the first time, that we'd especially strive to in that kind of language, that it was it's a big deal. Look how much time we're spending in our community talking about. That's why I said that. But it's not a bad deal, it's just a big deal. And we ought to talk about it. But when you think about those 4 factors, in order for it to have more weight, it would have to have a numerical value of some sort. The way it has more weight is when we sit and look at those 14 options that were presented in the most recent redistricting in the North County, and we winnow them down to 6, and then 4. We're constantly looking at the interplay of the factors and the utilization of the school, what it means in terms of kids' bus rides, what it means in terms of the geographic proximity or the geographic obstacles to kids getting to school, and who's been moved recently, and the sustainability of enrollment in schools, all of those things. So you look at the interplay and you work down, down, down. When I think about the especially strive to, what it means to me is that we don't choose an option that moves us backwards in diversity, and we don't choose an option that it may be very efficient, like we could save a little bit of money, but that moves us to a place with the diversity of our student body that we don't want to be. So let's say that there's a small difference in the bus routes that we will have to do, and it will increase it in order to level out the socioeconomic disparities that exist in a school, or we can save a small amount of money in these bus routes, but we'll create a very big disparity in the socioeconomic status of the students in these 2 schools. So you're looking at that interplay constantly and coming to what's the most reasonable response. Now, as a parent who's had children redistricted twice before my children all grew up, I didn't always feel like that was the most reasonable decision when I looked at it as a parent. But I understand it's how all these factors fit together, and then how do we create the best possible environment for our students in schools given the very real constraints that exist, whether they're geographic, whether utilization, whether it is the proximity and the bus times, whether, it's just all of those factors coming together. It is not a numerical formulaic process. It's judgment and looking at all these pieces. And I will have 6, 8, 12 people in my office. Then we'll take it to the associate superintendents and directors, and they will all look at it and ask questions and be very critical of it. And then we'll come back and look at it again. And then finally, we have to bring to you an imperfect plan, because every single plan is imperfect. There are no perfect plans. I'll say that 3 times, Ms. Evans. And so that's what it looks like when you look at it. And what those words said to me as the person who is primarily and first and most responsible for what happens here is that I need to pay attention to the well-being of our children. And one of the ways I do that is to pay attention to the economic, cultural, racial diversity of our school system, as well as paying attention to the budget, as well as paying attention to the programs and the curriculum and all those other factors. Sorry, that's a long answer, but it's a big question.
So we look at all the factors and we
Absolutely.
make sure that we're not worsening or creating disparity.
Yes, and sometimes you could have wonderful economic, really good schools that are economically very good in terms of diversity from the economic circumstance of the children, but it's going to make this school at 130% utilization and this one at 70. Can't do that. That's off the table. Or it's going to require kids, a whole school of kids who have bus times, if they ride a bus, in the range of 5 to 15 minutes, but these 3 neighborhoods are going to be on the bus for 45 minutes in that school. Can't do that. If the whole school's, or most of the school is in the range of 45-minute bus rides, then that's the expectation, because that's where people's homes are, and that's how it fits around that school. And you can picture our map and see where 5 to 15 minutes exists and where 15 to 45 minutes exists in terms of bus ranges. So you got to look at all of these aspects, and then you have to make a reasonable decision that fits within the policy.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of confusion around that, so I wanted to make sure that we talked about it.
I just wanted to comment on, in my 20 years on the board and having done multiple boundary decisions, every single one that I have reviewed here and raised my hand about, we have always looked at diversity and demographics. And prior to my election to the Board of Education in the mid to late 90s, I served on a boundary advisory committee in the Whitman cluster between Woodacres and Bannockburn, and absolutely demographics was a consideration in that boundary decision. I mean, I didn't get to vote on it, but because I was a PTA representative, but it was part of the information packet and part of what the board decided. But every single one of in the 20 years that I've participated in as a board member has always, and I think people forget that.
Thank you. Mr. Vestre, your light's still on. You have another
Sorry.
question? Okay. All right. So once again, we thank you all for your presentation today and for the work that you've done and that you will continue to do from February on until June. So thank you. It is 1:45. We said we were going to recess at 1:30. Is everyone okay that we recess and we come back with board comments after? Okay.